No one was talking about Joe Montana anymore. That alone should have been a warning. The cameras were locked on John Elway, his face, his posture, that confident half-smile he wore when he believed the game was already decided. Mile High Stadium was loud, violent with noise, shaking under the weight of 75,000 people who thought they were watching the final chapter. Denver was winning. The clock was bleeding out. The cold was biting. Everything pointed in one direction. Elway nodded to the sideline, already loosening his shoulders, already imagining the handshake at midfield. This was his environment. Thin air, pressure, late-game control. This was where his reputation was made. Across the field, Joe Montana stood completely still. No helmet on yet. No pacing. No frustration. Just silence. That silence didn't register with casual fans. But the men who had been in locker rooms, who had felt momentum turn without explanation, noticed it immediately. Because Joe Montana only gets quiet when something is about to break. The scoreboard flashed again. The Broncos had just scored. The crowd erupted. Confident now, too confident. On the Denver sideline, helmets bumped, coaches clapped, and someone laughed loudly, already celebrating a game that technically wasn't over. Elway jogged off the field and glanced once toward the opposite sideline. Montana hadn't moved. That bothered him. It wasn't fear. John Elway didn't fear Joe Montana. He had faced him before, studied him, competed against him at the highest level. He respected Montana, but respect is not the same as intimidation. Elway believed something most quarterbacks did, that Montana needed control, that Montana needed rhythm, that if you forced him to chase you exposed him, and right now Montana was chasing. Finally Montana picked up his helmet. The gesture was small, almost forgettable, but it snapped something into focus. The 49ers offense gathered instinctively, as if pulled by gravity. No panic, no rush, just movement, clean and deliberate. Montana stepped into the huddle. The noise outside vanished. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't say anything inspirational. He called the play once, slowly, clearly, then paused. Not to wait, to look. He scanned faces, linemen, receivers, a running back flexing his hands inside his gloves. He saw tension in one man's jaw, saw someone thinking too much about the clock. Montana leaned slightly forward. "We don't need everything," he said quietly. "We just need what's there." That was it. The huddle broke. On the Denver sideline, Elway watched closely now. He didn't know why. He just felt something shift. The kind of shift you feel when weather changes suddenly, when the air pressure drops without warning. Montana jogged to the line. The Broncos' defense spread out, ready. They expected caution, short throws, safe decisions, a slow, desperate attempt to survive. They had prepared for the wrong version of Joe Montana. The ball snapped. Montana dropped back. Not hurried, not frantic. The pocket began to compress almost immediately. A rusher broke through. The crowd surged, sensing collapse. Montana didn't flinch. One step forward, feet reset, ball released. The throw wasn't dramatic. No cannon, no miracle, just perfect placement, completion. First down. The noise didn't stop, but it changed. The next snap came fast. No huddle, another drop back, another defender free, another throw gone before the hit arrived, another first down. Elway's smile was gone now. He stepped closer to the field, hands on his hips, eyes locked on Montana. This wasn't panic, not yet, but recognition. He had seen this state before, the place where Montana stops reacting and starts deciding. Denver adjusted, blitz, pressure, force him to rush. Montana read it instantly. Snap, release, completion. Chains moved again. A Broncos assistant cursed under his breath. "This feels wrong," he said. Elway said nothing. The drive continued. Not fast, not slow, inevitable. Each play shaved seconds off the clock. Not recklessly, but with intent. Montana was carving time, bending it, making it obey him. And then something unsettling happened. The crowd went quiet. Not completely, but enough to notice. Because everyone, even Denver fans, understood what they were watching now. This wasn't a comeback yet. It was worse. It was control. Joe Montana wasn't trying to survive the moment. He was claiming it. And as Elway watched from the sideline, a truth he hated pressed into his mind. If this drive reached the end zone, no one would remember the lead. No one would remember the crowd. No one would remember that this was supposed to be his night. They would only remember who stayed calm when everything was on the line. And Joe Montana was just getting started. The first thing John Elway noticed was the clock. Not because it was running out, but because it suddenly felt irrelevant. Joe Montana was still on the field, still calm, still moving the offense like the game existed on a different timeline than the one hanging above the stadium. The Broncos' defense lined up again, shoulders tense now, breath shorter, eyes darting toward the sideline for answers that weren't coming fast enough. This wasn't how pressure was supposed to work. Pressure was supposed to squeeze the quarterback, force mistakes, speed decisions. But Montana looked slower, deliberately slower, as if he were daring the chaos to catch up. The next snap came. A linebacker blitzed, untouched, breaking through the line so cleanly that the crowd rose, sensing the hit before it happened. Montana saw him instantly, not with panic, but with acceptance. He drifted half a step to his left, just enough. The ball left his hand an instant before contact. A receiver caught it in stride. Another first down. The Broncos' sideline erupted, not in celebration, but in frustration. Coaches shouted adjustments. Hands waved. Helmets slammed together as players tried to wake themselves up, tried to reset the emotional balance of a game that was slipping into unfamiliar territory. John Elway turned to his offensive coordinator. "Hold them here," he said sharply. It wasn't a request. It was a command fueled by pride, because Elway understood something most fans didn't. This drive wasn't just about points. It was about ownership, about whose presence mattered more when everything else collapsed. And Montana was beginning to take something personal. The 49ers reached midfield. The crowd noise returned in bursts. Uneven, nervous. This wasn't the roar of dominance anymore. It was the sound of people trying to convince themselves nothing was wrong. Montana clapped his hands again. Snap. A play fake. The defense bit just enough. Montana rolled right, eyes downfield. A defender closed fast, arms extended, fingertips brushing Montana's jersey. For the first time on the drive, Montana took a hit. He went down hard. The stadium exploded. Elway clenched his fist. That was supposed to be the turning point, the reminder that Montana was human, that pressure still mattered, that the body eventually pays for staying in the pocket too long. Montana stayed on the ground for half a second longer than necessary, not because he was hurt, because he was thinking. He got up calmly, dusted off his jersey, and jogged back to the huddle without looking at the sideline. No concern, no discussion, no signal for help. That moment unsettled the Broncos more than the completions had, because now they knew hits weren't enough. Montana called the next play himself. The snap came quickly, no chance for the defense to settle. He dropped back, scanned, then threw across the middle into a window so tight it made defenders hesitate after the catch, unsure whether they'd just been beaten or baited. Another first down. John Elway exhaled slowly. He'd built his reputation on late-game comebacks, on forcing opponents into desperation, on watching them blink first. This was supposed to be the reversal, the night where Montana felt that weight. Instead, Elway felt something else creeping in. Helplessness, not panic, not fear. The realization that there was nothing he could do from the sideline. The drive crossed into Denver territory. The Broncos called a timeout. Players gathered around the defense coach, faces flushed, breath fogging in the cold air. The coach spoke fast, sharp, desperate. "Disguise it, make him guess." Montana stood alone near the numbers, helmet on, hands on his hips, staring at the field as if it were a diagram only he could read. Elway watched him closely. Montana wasn't staring at defenders. He was staring at space. Timeout ended. Montana jogged back to the huddle. He didn't change the play. Snap. The defense disguised nothing. They couldn't. Montana had already seen through it. A quick release to the sideline. Toe tap catch. Clock stopped. The crowd groaned. Now the noise was fully gone, replaced by murmurs, by anxious glances at the scoreboard, by the creeping awareness that something historic might be unfolding in the wrong direction. The Broncos rushed the line. Montana didn't hurry. Another snap, another completion. Inside the red zone, Elway felt the cold more sharply now. The air burned his lungs as he paced the sideline, helmet still on, jaw tight. He wasn't thinking about the next offensive series anymore. He was thinking about the headline, about how moments rewrite reputations. The Broncos' defense lined up one last time, backs against the wall, eyes wide, hands trembling with adrenaline. Montana stepped under center. He surveyed the defense, paused, then smiled, just slightly. The ball snapped. Play action. The linebackers froze for a fraction of a second. That was all Montana needed. He fired a pass toward the back of the end zone. High, precise, unreachable. Touchdown. For half a second, the stadium didn't react. Then chaos, but not the kind Elway wanted. The 49ers sideline erupted. Helmets flew. Coaches embraced. On the Denver side, players stood frozen, staring at the scoreboard as if it had betrayed them. Joe Montana jogged off the field without celebration. No fist pump, no shout, just business. John Elway stood still. The game wasn't over, but something else was. The belief that this night belonged to him. And as Montana took a seat on the bench, eyes already shifting toward the defense, one truth settled over the stadium, like a verdict. This wasn't a comeback, it was a takeover, and Elway was about to be forced back onto the field, not as the hero, but as the man racing against a clock that Joe Montana had already mastered. John Elway tightened his chin strap. He had been here before, too many times to count. Late fourth quarter, stadium tense, game hanging by a thread. This was where his legend lived, where comebacks were born, where doubt was supposed to belong to the other sideline, but this time felt different, not because of the
score, not because of the clock, because of who had just walked off the field. Joe Montana hadn't celebrated, hadn't looked back, hadn't acknowledged the crowd. That silence followed Elway as he stepped onto the field. The kickoff sailed deep. Elway caught the ball in his hands, feeling its weight, centering himself. The roar of the crowd returned instinctively. This was still Denver, still Mile High, still his moment if he wanted it. He jogged to the huddle. The Broncos gathered quickly, eyes locked on him, waiting for command. This was the moment they trusted him for, the reason his name echoed through the stadium long before this game. Elway looked at them, and for the first time all night, he didn't rush. "We've done this before," he said calmly. "Same rules, same ending." They broke the huddle. The snap came. Elway dropped back, scanning the field, the familiar rhythm settling in. The pocket held just long enough. He fired a pass down the seam. Hard, precise. Completion. The crowd erupted. There it was. The spark. The reminder, the surge of belief that made John Elway dangerous. The next play came fast. Another drop back, another throw. Short gain, but progress. The chains moved. Elway felt it now. The flow. The sense that the game was bending back toward him, just as it always had. He clapped his hands, urging the tempo higher. The defense adjusted. The 49ers didn't panic. They didn't blitz wildly. They didn't overcommit. They waited. Elway released another pass. This one contested. The receiver reached, fingertips grazing the ball before it bounced away. Incomplete. The clock kept moving. Elway exhaled, nodding. No problem. Still time. The next snap came. Pressure arrived quicker this time. A defender slipped past the line, forcing Elway to slide right. He kept his eyes downfield, searching, always searching. He found his receiver and threw on the run. The ball sailed just high. Incomplete again. Third down. The noise changed. Not fear. Expectation. Everyone in the stadium leaned forward. This was the down where legends either sharpened or slipped. Elway wiped his hands on his towel and stepped back under center. Snap. The pocket collapsed faster than before. He stepped up, then back, then spun away from pressure, muscle memory taking over. He launched the ball deep toward the sideline, trusting his arm, trusting his receiver, trusting history. The ball hung in the air for a heartbeat too long. A 49ers defensive back tracked it cleanly, intercepted. For a moment, nobody reacted. Then the reality hit. The defender went down immediately, smartly, preserving the clock. The 49ers sideline erupted, this time without restraint. Coaches shouted. Players leapt into each other's arms. John Elway stood frozen, hands on his hips, helmet tilted slightly upward, eyes locked on the turf. The clock kept ticking. Joe Montana rose from the bench. He didn't look at Elway. He looked at the officials. He jogged back onto the field, not hurried, not triumphant, just ready to finish what he had started. The huddle formed. Montana stepped in and spoke softly. "Same thing," he said. "Let's go home." The snap. A run up the middle. The defense burned a timeout. Another snap. Another short gain. The clock bled. Elway watched from the sideline now, helmet off, breath visible in the cold air. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defeated. He was reflective, because he understood what had happened. This wasn't about who threw farther, or who hit harder, or who had the louder stadium. This was about ownership of the moment. Joe Montana took the final snap and knelt. The game was over. The crowd fell into a stunned quiet, broken only by pockets of cheers from red jerseys scattered throughout the stands. On the field, players shook hands, pads clapping, respect exchanged without words. Elway and Montana met near midfield. No speeches, no smiles, just a brief handshake, a nod. Two men who understood exactly what had just been decided. Years later, people would argue about arm strength, about athleticism, about raw talent. They would replay highlights and debate careers. But those who were there remembered something else. They remembered the calm. They remembered the way the game slowed down for one man and sped up for the other. They remembered the night John Elway had time, space, and opportunity, and Joe Montana took all three away. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Because when the pressure was absolute, when the moment was unforgiving, when the game demanded a single steady presence, Joe Montana answered, and the legend stayed with him.